gang, it's Platt. Welcome back to another episode of One Gallon Brewing. Today we brew an amber ale. So let's go. Welcome back, gang. Time for another One Gallon Brewing video. Today we got a fun little style of beer. One of my favorite style of beers we're going to produce is an amber ale. Amber ales are something you'll see in most microbreweries around. It's generally one of the first few styles they produce, you know, up there with pale ales, blonde ales, IPAs, whatever. You generally will see an amber ale offered at most craft breweries. The style itself is a variation of a British pale ale or maybe a British bitters. With the name amber ale, though, we're going to be slightly darker in color. We're starting to add some of those darker malts. Instead of like toasty, bready notes that we got from like our pale ale, or our blonde ale, I mean. Now we're going to start getting some more toffee and caramel notes from the darker malts. As far as hop flavor, aroma, bitterness, whatever, we're going to use, this amber ale is more of an American style amber ale, which we're going to use American hops. Compared to the noble hops that you get in a pale ale, these hops tend to be a little more piney, a little more citrusy. The noble hops are a little more subtle, a little more floral, you'd say. So this can be slightly more hop aggressive compared to, again, the British style pale ale. I'm going to throw a little curveball in on this episode. Normally I would just use a regular US 05 ale yeast or whatever, but today we're going to try a Kviek ale yeast. For those of you that don't know, Kviek ale yeast is a different strain of yeast. It's Scandinavian in origin. Apparently a lot of the brewers, kind of a farmhouse ale type yeast, and they've just over the generations have reused it and kind of made it its own thing. Reason I'm using this is Kviek yeast works at a wider temperature range than standard ale yeast. On a standard ale yeast, if you ferment any warmer than the mid-70s, you're going to start getting some funky flavors, some fusel alcohol, some diactyls, some things that we don't want in our beer. But this Kviek yeast can work easily into the mid to upper 80s, even sometimes low 90s, without adding a funky flavor to your beer. And living in Las Vegas, it's summertime. I could crank the AC, but it's just going to get hot here, and where I keep my fermenters are most likely going to get into the low 80s. So to make that adjustment, I'm going with a Kviek ale yeast. Also, a couple other good things about the style of yeast. It's high flocculation, so it drops out easily. You know, it helps kind of clear that beer up. And it works a little faster than a traditional ale yeast. If the temperature goes up, it gets a little more aggressive in the fermentation and speeds the process up, which is always nice. Well, that being said, let's brew an amber ale. Well, alright, gang, I've got 1 gallon of hot water up to, or I've heated 1 gallon of water up to 160 degrees. We're going to do what's called the mash in. We want to rest the grains with the water at around 155, 154 degrees. We'll heat it to 160. When you add the grains, kind of cools it off a little bit. So let's add our grains real quick. Go over the grain bill. 2 pounds of pale two-row malt, 7.2 ounces of caramel 40 malt, 5 ounces of caramel 80 malt. Those numbers 40 and 80 kind of just tell you how dark the grains are. The higher the number, the darker the grains are. The longer, the darker the toast. So we're going to go ahead and add this to 1 gallon of water. That's called the mash in. And we're going to stir around. Make sure we, get all that grain fully immersed. You don't want any dough balls. And no, that wasn't my nickname in high school. Maybe you thought that. Anyway, we're going to make sure we get all those grains completely moisturized in there. Give them a good stir. Alright, and once we got everything incorporated, I'm going to kill the heat. We're going to put the lid on, and then we're going to let this sit for 1 hour. We're going to let the enzymes kick in and convert those starches to sugar. So we'll come back in 1 hour to do our mash out. All right, gang, so it's been about 1 hour, and I'm going to take the lid off. Everything looks pretty good in here. Our next step is we're going to bring the heat back on. I'm going to turn it back on. And we're going to raise this temperature up to 170 degrees. That is part of what's called the mash out. While that's going on, you might see over here I have another little pot with 3 quarts of water that I'm also going to bring up to 170 degrees. We are going to use that to rinse these grains, also to bring our total volume of water to where we have a 1 gallon batch. Remember, the grains in there absorbed a lot of the water, so this is to rinse those grains but also get us to the correct water volume for boiling. So let me heat these up to 170 and we'll come back to rinse our grains. Alright, gang, so I got both pots of water up to 170 degrees, so it's time to do our sparge or rinse our grain. Let me knock off the heat on both of these. And I've got my third pot here with my strainer ready to go. First, we're going to dump the grains. You definitely want gloves for this. Alright. Spread that out a little bit. Alright. Well, we're going to let that drain. I'm going to add the 3 quarts of water back to this original grain pot. So I'm going to make sure all those grains are part of this, so wash out those little pieces. Alright, just get my spoon for those last little bits of grain. Pull this up here now so I can work with it a little better. Alright, we're going to let this drip for a few minutes, and then we'll come back, we'll kick the heat on and we'll come back to start our boil. Alright, gang, so we're just starting our boil. You start to see a little foam up there. Again, I've talked about this before. You want to keep plenty of head space so you can avoid any boil overs. I'm going to give her a quick stir to kind of kill off that layer of foam. Again, to avoid foam over. And we're going to add our first hop addition at the start of this 60-minute boil. In here, I have 0.08 ounces of Amarillo hops and 0.08 ounces of Centennial going right in. See what I mean? You gotta really pay attention or this can boil over on you. Just a quick little stir, you see, kind of kills that. And we're going to let this sit till we have 15 minutes left in the boil, and that's when we'll do our next hop addition. Alright, gang, we have 15 minutes left in the boil. We're going to do our next hop addition. It's a repeat of the last one, 0.08 ounces of Amarillo hops and 0.08 ounces of Centennial hops. We'll just dump those in there. Kicked up the boil a little bit. We'll come back in 10 minutes to do our last hop addition. And lastly, with 5 minutes left in the boil, we're going to do our last hop addition. This time we're adding 0.24 ounces of Amarillo hops, no Centennial in this addition. You're just going to dump her in and wait for the last 5 minutes until we flame out. All right, time to cool off our beer. We're going to put this in a quick little ice bath. Again, as I said in the previous videos, this is one of the best reasons to do 1 gallon brews, because you can just cool down your wort so much faster. We're going to cool this down to 80 degrees. That's going to be our pitching temperature. Put it in the fermenter and pitch the yeast. So we'll come back to wrap up. All right, gang, to wrap up, we've brewed 1 gallon of amber ale. Let's review the recipe real quick. First, 2 pounds of pale 2-row malt, 7.2 ounces of caramel 40 malt, 5 ounces of caramel 80 malt. Remember, those numbers just kind of indicate the color of the malt or how well they've been toasted. Our hops addition, at start of boil, we added 0.08 ounces of Amarillo hops and 0.08 ounce of Centennial hops. With 15 minutes left in the boil, we added 0.08 ounce of Amarillo hops, 0.08 ounce of Centennial hops, and then with 5 minutes left in the boil, we added 0.24 ounces of Amarillo hops. We pitched in roughly 2 to 3 grams of Kviek yeast. Our projected ABV on this beer is 5.6% ABV, and the IBU is projected out at 37. I did an original gravity reading. We came out to 1.050, which means if we get any lower than 1.010, we should be in that mid-5 range, so we're looking about right. We're going to leave, normally we would leave this in primary for 2 weeks and then secondary for a couple weeks. We may come back in a week to 10 days and do a gravity reading. Because the Kviek yeast works a little faster, highly flocculent, so it'll drop out. This might get done a little bit earlier as far as the primary fermentation, so maybe 10 days. We'll project on that. Then we'll rack and put it in secondary for a couple of weeks. Then we'll bottle, and we'll bottle condition for about a week or so, and then we should be ready to have this amber ale ready to drink in about a month or so. I will post somewhere down the line another tasting video where I will give this a try. One last thing, I will leave down below, besides the recipe, I will also leave a couple of links to videos where I talk about homebrewing sanitation, homebrewing safety, bottling, stuff like that, in case you have any questions. Well, I hope you liked this video. If you did, please subscribe down below. Also, please like the video because it lets YouTube know we're putting out good content. If you have any questions, comments, concerns, or beers that you'd like me to try to brew, please leave me in the comment section, or you can always contact me on the Twitter page. Till next time, bottoms up.